In one single night, Grace's entire world shattered. What she thought was impossible happened right before her eyes. She returned home quietly, expecting peace, only to open her bedroom door and meet the shock of her life. Her own husband, Michael, entangled with her church sister, Blessing. The same woman she prayed with, the same woman she trusted, the same woman she welcomed into her home. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled, and her spirit cried out. It felt like a knife cutting through her soul. Michael tried to cover his shame with excuses. Blessing pretended to weep, calling the devil a liar. But in that moment, Grace saw through the mask. Behind those crocodile tears was a smile of victory, a smile of mockery. She realized the betrayal was deeper than just weakness. It was planned, calculated, deliberate. Her husband's words cut her even more than the act itself. Instead of remorse, he accused her of embarrassment, shattering what little dignity she held onto. Grace's world spun before her eyes. The man she thought was her protector had become her betrayer. The sister she thought was family had become her enemy. And just when she thought she had seen it all, Blessing whispered words that chilled her to the bone. "This is only the beginning." Grace froze. Her tears turned to terror. Her heart turned to fire. Because now she knew this was not just an affair. This was war. Long before that night of betrayal, the seeds of destruction had already been planted. Blessing was not the helpless sister Grace thought she was. She came into Grace's life with a smile that hid sharp fangs. With every "God bless you" and every "Amen," she was studying Grace's weaknesses, patiently waiting for her moment. It started innocently. A prayer request here, a casual visit there. Blessing would come after fellowship, claiming she had nowhere else to go. Grace, full of love and trust, opened her doors without question. She cooked for her, she shared her clothes, she even shared her secrets, secrets only a sister in Christ should know. But behind Blessing's eyes was calculation. She noticed the times Michael came home from work. She noticed the arguments that sometimes flared between husband and wife. She noticed Grace's trust, and she planned to exploit it. She would deliberately arrive when Grace wasn't around, pretending to wait. She would ask innocent questions about Michael's work, laughing too freely at his jokes, calling him Brother Michael in front of Grace, but using softer tones when Grace turned away. Grace never suspected. She thought she was simply helping a sister in need. But in truth, Blessing was weaving her web, slowly, carefully, step by step, until even Michael, who once looked at her as just a church member, began to notice her presence. She knew how to look pitiful enough to be helped, spiritual enough to be trusted, and seductive enough to stir desire. It was a dangerous mix, and Grace never saw the storm coming. What happened in that bedroom was not a sudden mistake. It was a calculated trap, a trap Blessing had set and Michael had walked into. And while Grace was still drowning in tears, Blessing was already smiling inside, because for her, everything was going according to plan. Grace's tears had not yet dried when the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. At first, she thought it was just temptation that led her husband astray, but as she replayed every moment in her mind, the truth began to scream louder than her pain. Blessing's actions had never been ordinary. She remembered the late-night phone calls Blessing claimed were prayer emergencies. She remembered how Blessing insisted on sleeping over whenever Michael was around, but avoided when he traveled. She remembered the strange looks she ignored because she believed too much in love and loyalty. Now, everything made sense. Blessing had not stumbled into sin. She had studied her. She had studied her home. She had studied her husband. It was no accident. It was a mission. Grace's heart burned with a mix of sorrow and anger. The betrayal was no longer just about infidelity. It was about a sister she trusted turning her kindness into a weapon. And then came the whispers. A neighbor who had seen Blessing at odd hours. A church member who noticed how close she sat to Michael when Grace wasn't around. Tiny clues Grace once ignored now formed a clear, ugly picture. Blessing had been targeting her family all along. But the most terrifying realization was this: Blessing was not finished. The smirk, the cold whisper, "This is only the beginning," proved that her agenda ran deeper. Grace's marriage was not the only thing at risk. Her faith, her dignity, and her very peace of mind were under attack. She had uncovered the truth, but she still did not know how far Blessing was willing to go or how much destruction she had already planned. The house was silent, but Michael's conscience was loud. Days after Grace's discovery, he could no longer hide behind excuses. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, and his wife's broken eyes haunted him every second. One evening, unable to bear it anymore, he confessed. At first, he tried to call it weakness, a mistake, but as Grace pressed him for the full truth, his defenses crumbled. His voice shook, his face wet with shame, as he revealed what Grace had feared all along. Blessing had set a trap. It began with innocent conversations, prayers, advice, encouragement. She would come when Grace was not around, always with a reason, always with a smile. She played the role of a humble sister, yet behind the mask was a cunning seductress. Michael admitted how she slowly drew him in, how she touched his hand lightly when offering prayers, how she called him late at night under the guise of seeking counsel, how she cried fake tears, telling him stories of loneliness and rejection until he felt pity. And pity turned into desire. Michael confessed that the first time was not an accident. Blessing had planned it, knowing when Grace would be away, knowing how to make herself irresistible, knowing exactly how to twist his weakness. But the most chilling part of his confession was this: Blessing had told him that Grace was too busy with church work to care for her husband. She whispered poison into his ears, making him see his wife not as a partner, but as a woman who had failed him. And he believed her. Grace's heart shattered all over again. Not only had her husband betrayed her, but he had allowed another woman, her own church sister, to turn him against her. The betrayal was deeper than flesh. It was war on her marriage, war on her trust, war on her soul. Michael wept, begging for forgiveness, but Grace could not find words, because in his confession, she heard something far more dangerous. Blessing was not just a woman after her husband, she was a woman with a mission to destroy. News travels fast. What began in the secrecy of Grace's bedroom spilled into the open halls of the church. Whispers filled the pews. Eyes followed Grace wherever she went. Some were filled with pity, others with judgment, and many with quiet curiosity. The sanctuary, once her place of refuge, now felt like a battlefield of shame. Michael sat in silence during services, his head bowed, avoiding the stares of brethren who once respected him. But Blessing walked in boldly, dressed in her finest clothes, with a smile that dared anyone to question her. Some members called it temptation, others called it weakness, but the truth was divided. There were those who blamed Michael, those who blamed Blessing, and those who, without mercy, blamed Grace herself. How could she let another woman get so close? Why didn't she protect her home better? Maybe she was too proud, too committed to church work, and forgot her husband. The voices stung deeper than any knife. Grace, who had served faithfully, who had given her all to the church, suddenly found herself judged by the very people she once lifted in prayer. But not everyone turned against her. A few sisters drew close, whispering words of comfort. Some elders demanded that Blessing be disciplined. Yet, even in the midst of the scandal, Blessing played the victim, shedding tears before the congregation, claiming the devil had deceived her. Grace watched in disbelief as some believed her lies, clapping her on the back and telling her to stay strong in the Lord. The betrayal was no longer confined to her home. It had spilled into the house of God, and for Grace, the wound cut deeper each day. But beneath the whispers and the pity, one thing became clear to her. This was no ordinary scandal. Blessing's confidence in the face of exposure meant she was hiding something much darker, and Grace was determined to uncover it. Grace's spirit would not rest. The smirk on Blessing's face, the confidence in her walk, the shameless lies she told in church, none of it matched the story of a woman caught in weakness. There had to be more, so Grace began to dig, quietly, patiently. She asked questions in whispers, spoke to neighbors who had seen more than they first revealed, and reached out to women she remembered seeing Blessing with in the past. The truth that emerged was darker than she imagined. Blessing was not new to this. She had left a trail of broken homes behind her. In another town, a woman wept as she recounted how Blessing destroyed her marriage, luring her husband with the same tactics: fake prayers, crocodile tears, and late-night visits. In yet another place, an elder confessed that Blessing had stolen money meant for a cooperative society, vanishing for months before reappearing in a new city. Everywhere she went, Blessing left scars: broken families, empty wallets, betrayed friendships. Grace felt her knees weaken as she pieced it together. Blessing was not just a desperate woman. She was a predator, a woman who lived off the destruction of others, wearing the mask of a church sister to gain trust, only to strike when her victims least expected it. The pattern was clear. She always targeted kind, trusting women and their husbands. Grace's anger turned into determination. If she had been silent before, she could no longer afford to be. Blessing was not only after her home, she was a danger to many others. And as she stood with the evidence in her hands, she knew the fight was no longer just for her marriage. It was for every woman who had suffered in silence. Grace whispered a prayer through her tears, but this time, it was not a prayer of weakness. It was a prayer of war. Grace was no longer alone. As she reached out, one by one, the faces of Blessing's victims began to emerge from the shadows. Women who had once been silent found their voices in Grace's courage. Each story was different, but the pain was the same. Broken vows, stolen money, shattered trust. They sat together in small circles, their tears flowing freely, their voices trembling as they spoke. For years, they thought they were isolated, each believing their suffering was unique. But now they realized Blessing had woven the same web across many lives. And for the first time, they felt hope. Grace looked into their eyes and saw what she herself had felt: humiliation, betrayal, and anger. But beneath it all was a hunger for justice. Together, they made a vow, not just to comfort each other, but to fight back. They gathered evidence: old messages, bank transfers, witness accounts. Some even had pictures. Piece by piece, they built a case strong enough to pierce Blessing's carefully crafted mask. But it wasn't just about exposing her lies. It was about reclaiming their dignity. Grace, once broken and in tears, now stood at the center of this alliance like a warrior rising from ashes. She realized that the power Blessing used against them was the silence of their shame, and by uniting, they were breaking that silence forever. The women prayed, not the quiet, weak prayers of fear, but fiery prayers of strength. And with each prayer, their resolve grew stronger. The trap was being set. The stage was being prepared. And Blessing, in her arrogance, had no idea that her downfall was already in motion. The time for silence was over. Grace and the women had carried their pain long enough. Now they carried a plan to expose the wolf that had walked freely in sheep's clothing for far too long. They knew Blessing's pattern, they knew her pride, and they knew she would never resist the chance to perform her false humility before the church. So they set the trap. On a Sunday morning, when the congregation was at its fullest, the women positioned themselves quietly among the pews. Each one held a piece of the puzzle: messages, receipts, testimonies, evidence of Blessing's deception. Grace sat at the front, her heart pounding, her Bible in her hands, not as a shield of fear, but as a sword of courage. Blessing walked in, confident as always, her head high, her steps graceful, her face painted with the innocence of a devoted sister. She did not know that her past was about to stand up and speak louder than her lies. The service went on as usual: songs of praise, prayers of thanksgiving, the pastor's sermon. But beneath the holy atmosphere, tension brewed. The women exchanged glances, waiting for the right moment. And when the time came, Grace rose to her feet. Her voice was steady, her eyes fixed on the woman who had tried to destroy her home. She called Blessing's name, not in anger, but in authority. One by one, the other victims stood, lifting their voices, revealing the truth. Stories that matched, evidence that could not be denied, proof that pierced through every excuse. The congregation gasped, murmurs filled the air. Eyes that once looked at Blessing with respect now saw her mask breaking apart. The trap had been sprung, and for the first time, Blessing's confident smile began to fade. The church erupted in chaos. Voices clashed, hands pointed, and the once holy silence was broken by cries of shock and anger. Blessing stood frozen, her boldness stripped away as evidence after evidence poured out against her. The women spoke with trembling voices, but their truth was louder than Blessing's denials. Screenshots of messages, records of stolen money, stories that echoed one another like a chorus of pain. The pastor, his face heavy with sorrow, demanded order, but even he could not shield Blessing now. Her lies, carefully woven for years, had unraveled before the eyes of the congregation. Grace stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. For the first time since her betrayal, she stood tall, not as a victim, but as a woman of strength. She declared the truth plainly, exposing how Blessing had manipulated, seduced, and destroyed without remorse. Blessing broke. Her tears were no longer an act, but a cry of desperation. She tried to speak, to twist the story, but the evidence was undeniable. The murmurs of the congregation turned into shouts. "Shame! Enough is enough! This is wickedness!" And then came the final blow. Among the crowd stood one of Blessing's former victims who had quietly reported her past crimes to the authorities. Police officers stepped into the sanctuary, their presence commanding silence. The congregation parted as they walked down the aisle, their footsteps echoing like judgment itself. Blessing's eyes widened in horror. She tried to run, but hands reached out, holding her back. The same people who once embraced her now turned away in disgust. The handcuffs clicked shut. The mask was gone. The hunter had become the hunted. And as Blessing was led away, her screams filled the church, not with power, but with defeat. Grace closed her eyes, tears falling once more. But this time, they were not tears of pain. They were tears of release. The storm had broken, but the journey was not yet over. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. Grace stood in the silence of her home, the same home that once carried the echoes of betrayal. The pain had not vanished overnight, but something stronger had risen in its place: resilience. Michael, humbled and broken, sought forgiveness daily. His shame was heavy, but Grace knew her healing could not depend on his repentance alone. Her journey was no longer about saving a marriage, it was about saving herself. The church, once filled with whispers, now looked at her with a new respect, not as the woman who was betrayed, but as the woman who fought back, the woman who exposed evil, not with fists, but with truth. Grace made a choice. She would not allow her story to end in bitterness. Instead, she turned her pain into purpose. She began to gather women, the wounded, the silenced, the ones who felt alone. She listened to their stories, shared her own, and together they found strength. The Fellowship of Broken Hearts became a ministry of healing. Through workshops, prayers, and open conversations, Grace showed them that betrayal did not have to define their lives, that shame could be turned into testimony, that scars could become symbols of survival. And slowly, as the days turned into months, laughter returned to her home. Not the shallow laughter of ignorance, but the deep, healing laughter of a woman who had walked through fire and come out stronger. Blessing's chapter was closed, but Grace's story was only beginning. Her tears had watered the ground of her destiny. Her pain had birthed a new calling. Her brokenness had become her weapon. And now, she was no longer just Grace, the betrayed wife. She was Grace, the voice of many women, the light that shone in the darkness, the proof that no matter how deep the wound, healing is possible. In life, betrayal often comes from the people we trust the most. Grace's story is a reminder that not every sister in church is truly your sister in spirit. Through heartbreak, humiliation, and pain, she found her strength and turned her scars into wisdom. Blessing's lies may have shaken her home, but they could not destroy her spirit. And Michael's weakness became a lesson that true love requires loyalty, not just words. In the end, Grace chose not to be defined by betrayal, but by her courage to rise again. To every woman listening, remember, your worth is not tied to anyone's actions, but to the strength within you. Betrayal may wound you, but it can also build you, if you refuse to stay broken. This was She Trusted Her Church Sister Until She Found Her with Her Husband. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful African stories that teach, inspire, and keep you on the edge of your seat.